Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothschild.
Uh, Jeremy, we've got some interesting topics to delve into in this show. More of a, kind of an extension of some of the deeper dives we've been taking over the last couple of years, and everything from 9/11 to 11/9 to getting into the Epstein network, into some of the kind of, I guess, in some ways, might be a consortium of some of the topics that we've discussed in recent months and over the last couple of years. We're going to be talking quite a bit, I think, about a man by the name of Meshulam Riklis, who appears to have a very interesting. There's a connection there with both of the apparent presidential candidates for the 2020 election, that being the sitting President Trump, as well as the at this point the Democratic Party nominee Joe Biden. Some connections there. We're going to go into Meshulam Riklis and some of the influential figures he's cultivated relationships over the decades. And we'll also, I think, hit on a few other topics that are all kind of interrelated together. We're going to do that in a few minutes. But first, I guess what we'd like to start out with is just maybe both of us can take turns talking a little bit about where our minds are at right now as it relates to this ongoing pandemic, or as you've referred to it as a plandemic.
Well, I just seen that's what some people on the internet call it, the plandemic. So I've just come up with trust the plandemic question mark.
I like it. I trust the plandemic. I really like that. But just after, we're entering. God, I think we're getting close to 2 months of. Well, not quite there yet. We're close to about 7 weeks. I want to say around 7 weeks into this. What started obviously the announcement that this was a global pandemic on March 11th, Wednesday, March 11th, which began the very rapid just shutdown of pretty much everything, and still going on now in its 7th week. Some places we're seeing starting to reopen. I imagine I might be going back to work relatively soon. But after 7 weeks, we've
Greg, can you speak right into your phone?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay. We've had a chance to process a lot of things, and I think for me, I'm just really at this point, just speaking from a strictly looking at it through the lens of like a political perspective, looking at it from the lens of like the sitting administration and a lot of the politics surrounding this, the combination of the continuing, I would say, just complete circus that is the Trump presidency at this point, the Trump press conferences and all of the controversies around things Trump has said, and or one of his major proponents, things he didn't say, and just the he said of the circus of all of this, and then obviously the presumptive Democratic nominee and all the problems surrounding him. It's just like this is I think right now, I think we're living within the course of right now during a major crisis, that's taking place right now, regardless of your feelings about the actual nature of COVID-19, what it is, what it isn't, how people are overreacting or underreacting or whatever you think. There's no doubt this is a major crisis that's taking place in our society right now through the unprecedented shutdown of so many sectors of our society, both domestically as well as globally. But we're seeing play out in the process of this the biggest political circus I've ever seen. This is just an unprecedented level of just of ridiculous's playing out on the American political circuit right now.
Well, yeah, it's worse than ridiculousness. It's
it's an understatement.
It's sort of like calling the cover up that happened after Americans and people from around the world were basically vaporized in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, and then there's an immediate cover up, and then that's immediately used to then create further authoritarianism and aggressive warfare. I'd say that this is in that realm in terms of seriousness, and that this exceeds the kind of sort of political circus that we saw around the question of the Trump impeachment and all of that we dealt with a lot. This looks like an attack on the people of the planet in many ways, and there's a strong American component to it. And it's not, I don't believe it's isolated, but there is a strong, seditious, potentially treasonous American component to this. and the president at best is helping facilitate it through his own malignant narcissism, basically, is as at the very best that you could say about it. And so I want to move through this, but I just wanted to touch on some of my thoughts about where I am right now in terms of thinking about our situation. And I've expressed that we got to think through this both in relationship to the hard core aspect of biology, of epidemiology, of the immediate health security of ourselves and our families, and then also in terms of the political and the economic. And we have to do both of those at the same time. And it's pretty clear to me that there was other options here in terms of how to approach this, and now what we're seeing is an intense. This to me is like, we talked a lot about how after the 11/9 operation, i.e. the installation of the Trump pump and dump Trump operation, that is still being covered up to this day in terms of, sure, psychological warfare, sure, Cambridge Analytica, sure, all the domestic actors, sure, the Russian intelligence aspect of it. But once again, the information warfare aspect of it is just the PR dressing to convince people that elections actually happen in this country, rather than selections that are not just based on trying to herd people's minds, but that are based on, on real rubber to the road covert operations controlling both and voting machines, of the voting machinery, but then also the counting and reporting side of the machinery. Okay, so this, at the time, as we were unpacking that aspect, and then the then investigation of quote unquote Trump Russia, we saw what used to be called the truth movement begin to sort of play the other side almost and run cover for the depth of the level of the criminality to support the level of criminality. If we'd seen, like in the wake of 9/11, like the truth movement support George W. Bush as running some kind of covert operation where he's going to round up all the traitors, and don't worry, he has this, then things get going badly, Patriot Act is passed, some of the questioners or opponents of aspects of the Patriot Act are anthrax, or at least they have anthrax sent to their office. Then multiple wars in different theaters in an entire region of the world are then being launched, and yet trust the plan. There's a secret agenda here. I mean, so there's a lot of devolution that we're dealing with, and I'm seeing even more of that in relationship to the 3/11, the globally announced pandemic, which looks more and more like it was in some way to me, it looks like a combination of a bioweapon that's then facilitated or allowed to spread in certain ways. And more we're hearing about different strains in different parts of the world, or different parts of the world, including within the country in the United States of America here, being targeted. I would not put it past the kind of people that would play around with things like bioweapons. And then, so what we have then is the sort of same kind of realm of the people who were running cover for the 11/9 operation, basically saying that it was a nothing burger. And we pointed some of this out in our critique of James Corbett's follow-up to his intensely effective 9/11 a conspiracy video, with his Trump Russia conspiracy nothing burger video, where we pointed out that it looked like he had gone the other direction. And not only was it not as effective a video, but he was actually ending up covering up for the level of the conspiracy that was not being talked about by those that were talking about Trump Russia. Okay, so I'm seeing that on steroids right now. The people who are talking about it's just a flu, open it up, all that type of stuff. They don't even have a grasp on the flu. Okay, and we've heard, from early on, like as I was trying to talk about things with friends and family, I was talking about that, the early analysis of what was, COVID, what was called COVID-19, what it was looking like was that it spread intensely, where it had an R naught of anywhere in the realm of somewhere from above 2 to even up to 7 or something like that, which is fairly communicative, which is aggressively communicative, you might say, and that it was in the realm that we didn't know, but given the statement that the flu is 0.1% case fatality rate, that this was on the order of more than 10% as potentially deadly as the flu. But meanwhile, looking back on it, I'm pretty clear now, looking at some of the numbers, that these numbers that are being put forth by people say this is just the flu, that the flu isn't even as deadly as it's said to be. And that probably when it comes down to it, a few thousand people actually probably die every single year at the most directly from the flu. Meanwhile, this thing, COVID-19, there's lots of young, people, military age people, I might say, even if they're not in the military. But remember, the front lines of this war against the silent, invisible enemy, is the 30-year-old health care workers. They're on the front lines where this thing is raging. And it's not raging everywhere, i.e., like people stayed home and didn't gather together in big groups as much as they were. And some of that worked to make it not as severe as it could have been, and that's putting aside all the questions of where different strains, how it's spread in different ways, what's behind all of that. But so this looks much more like a bioweapon than the flu season. Okay, this is putting 30-year-olds out of commission. We still don't even know what the long-term effects are of cases that are seen as just a little bit more than mild, where it gets into organs. It causes potential long-term damage from everywhere from, things like the, internal organs to the lungs to even aspects of the brain stem. And does it keep coming back? There's still talk about the herd immunity. If we just open up and we let all the healthy people out, then we'll get to herd immunity. Can you get to herd immunity with something that might be a bioweapon and that has potential multiple inserts? Most natural coronaviruses don't even lend much long-term immunity when you get them anyways. And the vaccine, isn't a vaccine is even possible without even dealing with the question of, the intent behind that. Okay. So there's a lot of people talking as if they know what's going on and they know what we need to do. Here's what I believe I know what we need to do. And I'll just, sum up here is that I think we need to, on this front, we need to focus on our health security, as that's our individual right and responsibility for us as individuals and us for our family and loved ones. And so a large piece of that, I believe, has to do with things like nutrition and food. And so then that then begins to bridge the question of food security, which has obvious economic and political implications, and we're beginning to see it right now. And that both the quote unquote both sides of this bickering so-called public debate about this, the open it uppers and the sort of keep it closed downers, are both not actually correct, in that there is aspects of the food insecurity that seems to be approaching that comes from both of them, right? So there are lots of reports of that the meat packing plants and the meat processing plants all around the country are hotbeds, which is very understandable. They're almost like prisons in terms of the closeness. They are ideal environments for communicative, disease to spread. And it's happening, and meat processing plants are being closed down, and so that is going to be an issue moving forward. And then at the same time, there's also obviously an economic piece to this about the way that the closures are being done. Instead of, encouraging the American people to make masks and wear masks, even if not for themselves at all, let's say, but just to contain asymptomatic spread, which anyone who was paying attention knew there was this thing going on very early on here, that people who did not even have symptoms could be serious spreaders. And all at levels of our government basically failed us. And not only they failed us, they were worse than that. I've pointed out before. They were telling us not to wear masks. And it's largely because they had not prepared the healthcare workers to have enough masks. And so they were worried about being actually grown-ups with the American people and being like, okay, don't buy the masks that the healthcare workers might need. We failed to plan and thus plan to fail in terms of that. But now we need to remediate that. So, but we are asking you, the American people, to take responsibility for you and your family, wrap things around your face so that we, at the very least, don't spread this to each other. All right. That early on could have actually made it very possible, and so that things did not even have to be shut down as much. And then it's obvious that the shutdown is a fraud at some level in terms of what's essential. The small businesses are sort of pushed out, but then the big box stores are consolidating assets, consolidating contracts with the federal government, consolidating eventually workers, right? Sort of creating a new sort of captive work population that feels similar to the deal of the century was being proposed to the Palestinian captive population by the Kushner group, right? So there's a lot of issues here. But in general, there's a lot of people that complain about how wearing a mask is the worst thing to your individual freedom since the Patriot Act or something like that.
Yeah, that reminds me of Candace Owens complaining about having to wear Muslim-like garb around her face at a Whole Foods store in D.C. I mean, you've seen quite a bit of that.
It makes you begin to wonder about whether there was a actual, things of cultural, traditional, regional wisdom that had to do with the covering of faces, in relationship to, groups that didn't know each other, potentially out in the public, that kind of thing, And so now, as we are needing to choose to decide to potentially protect others, even maybe, that's the guarantee of wearing something that wraps around your face, is that you are doing a stronger job to make sure that you're not, spreading it to other people if you don't even know you have it and you have a very minor case. But meanwhile, there are ways to do it in ways that are very effective. And I will include some links that include things like making salt masks. You can just do this with all kinds of different materials, organic cotton, old or just any kind of cotton, old T-shirts, and then you boil it up basically in a little low level of salt water, non-iodized salt water, and you have something that can basically kill a virus as it enters, it looks like, or denature it to some extent. So there's lots of possibilities here, and so I am very focused on those aspects, and then food. And then beginning to take back our sovereignty of our food. And this is where the politics of all this come in. This is a moment where the question about sovereignty and the level of sovereignty in terms of both politics and economics is coming into view. All right. And so this is my big hope for this moment, and my big sort of push, my missive for this moment, is that the people, we the people, that includes we the American people, understand that we're not just the ones who just sit on a couch and wait for history to happen to us, or being told when we're going to be allowed out, or when we're going to be allowed to go back to quote unquote normal. Normal was what led to this. Okay, so now we need to figure out what's after the so-called normal that led to this. So there are those, and they might be related to people who were involved in either the origins of this and or the sort of in the spread of this, or the response to this, who have a plan for an authoritarian style, a technocratic approach to the future for all of this, for the economy and for biology and for health. Okay. Now there are other approaches, but they need us to be involved in creating them and making them happen. And so one way to start is right there in terms of your food. And how do you make contact with the ground, with the earth, or do you make contact with the local producers of food, farmers, gardeners? And so that I think that is a key piece to start. And so the next up, maybe we can begin to talk about what is the question of democracy. Are we really trying to just go back to some fake sort of selection between Biden and Trump, if that's even going to happen, or do we want to actually be the leaders that we thought we were voting for?
Yes, I've actually had a lot of thoughts going through our mind as you've been saying all of this, and I will wrap up this portion of our conversation by saying a couple things. First of all, I would like to thank you personally, Jeremy, for alerting me and letting me know so I can inform my family about these impending these factory shutdowns here in the state of Missouri, how they're going to be affecting us, and preparing me and putting together a list of local farmers to get in contact with regarding turning to for meat supply in case in the event of, and also probably permanently long-term nature would be better in the long-term nature. So I'd like to thank you for that as a way to help prepare, me and people in my family who we've talked about before may not be as quite as ready or quite as seeing or visibly able to see some of like the things that you and I and others who are kind of in this sphere are able to see about possible events that might be coming down the pike with this worst case scenario style economic, political, or even as it relates to things like food supply. So I'd like to thank you for that. And what you were saying, this is something that it's very clear. I think most people fundamentally, at least subconsciously, have an understanding that our society is not going to be the same again after the way we live. It's not going to be the same again after things are never going to go back to the way they were before the beginning, before March 11th, basically, ever. I mean, there's permanent changes in our lives, the way we live, the way we communicate with people. But as you're saying here, I mean, do we really want to go back to normal where we were living in this world where I think it's now become in some ways maybe more obvious the absurdity of the times we're living in, but do we want to go back to the way it was before? That's a great question. As we've been talking about in private conversations, the world is not going to be the same way. It's not going to be the same as it was prior to all of this beginning, but is it going to be worse? Is it going to be a world ruled by a combination of technocrats and then these hawks who want to use this event to start whatever plans are in place for the next big national security threat as the next step of the post 9/11 era world we lived in, which of course is China, at least rhetorically, is being set up to be that. We want to live in a world dominated by technocrats and these hawks who are just a combination of trying to dictate the way we live our lives, which is already going on before that. But I mean, this is a really heavy-handed way to normalize people to this new norm of social contacting and all this other stuff. Do we want to live in a worse world, or do we want to try to make it a better place? And I mean, the thing is that this is one of the things that really worries me in the aftermath of this, is that I've always compared elements of like the conspiracy-oriented culture with the old Twilight Zone episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, where a little boy tells all of his neighbors on Maple Street that each of their neighbors, they're monsters. Meanwhile, the UFOs are watching, aliens are watching in their spaceship and laughing at the gullible humans who have been led to believe that they're all monsters, making them much easier to conquer. And so I thought of an analogy with this is that in this, we're seeing that no one really trusts each other as far as any type of public health or safety guidelines that are brought down, people are going to be inherently skeptical of them, and vice versa. I mean, this is one of the things where these type of operations are so effective at dividing people and turning people who should be natural allies with each other, we the people, against each other. And you're really seeing that with the we've seen this for so long, but really you see the partisanship. I mean, I thought partisanship was like a between Republicans and Democrats is kind of a thing of the past with like the center and all this. But I mean, once again, you're seeing a consolidation of people even around someone like Joe Biden as a result, I think, of the absurdity of so much what we're seeing under Trump. I did not think that was possible a year ago. But, we need to, I think, if we want to create a better world, I mean, those of us who are the regular people somehow have to come together, and there have to be ways to actually envision a better society rather than the new normal, rather than what you described as the normalization that we lived in before all of this started. And really, when I think about it, we really don't want to go back to having that as much quote unquote freedom as we believe it afforded us beforehand. We don't really want to go back to that. I think it's our responsibility to try to come together and make something better. That's one of the things I really appreciate that you bring to the table, Jeremy. You're always thinking about this from the perspective of what you call the radical middle and the importance of this. So,
well, thank you, Greg, and thank you for stepping up to be a leader for you and yours. Because it's a time when people, some people are just crawling into their couch and watching Netflix and just waiting for the all's clear.
We're all guilty of that to some level.
Yes, I mean, but the question is whether we're willing to engage in our discomfort of unknowing, and so that's part of it. And you're right, though. Like, we're all like trying to sort of cling on to our bits of normal, from before in certain ways. But the main thing, I think, is that we want to engage with what is it about our freedom. And I would say it often comes with, or maybe always comes with, the question of responsibility. Freedom is enabled, maybe, or is created by responsibility. And freedom, we got confused, I think, into thinking that freedom had something to do with just sort of like endless options, rather than a focus on what's the seriousness of our rights and our nourishing responsibilities in the world. And I guess that's why I sort of got on a trip about the people who are like, don't tell me to wear a mask, is like, that I've noticed that, that very few people in the United States of America have actually utilized any little piece of their First Amendment protected rights, which includes speech in the public sphere. And people think that like saying some crap on email or on Twitter or on YouTube or on 4chan, that's the public sphere. It's not. At best, it's a mall in California that you're allowed to set up your table and, pass out your flyers as long as you don't piss off the owners of the mall too much. But meanwhile, the actual public sphere has been basically turned into a vacuum. A lot of that was planned. I've mentioned it before, even physically in the United States, that there's aspects of the West that was actually physically planned to not have public squares. Like aspects of the East actually still have sort of public squares. The West does not really have those central public squares. I believe that was probably planned to make sure that actual public assembly was not encouraged. Okay, so but no matter what the origins of that, we are having to confront the fact that we have basically taken for granted our rights that we thought or said were protected by a piece of paper. Remember Bush? He was throwing it in our faces when he called the Constitution just a GD piece of paper. And I pointed out before, it is, unless you do something with it, unless you wield it as a shield. But meanwhile, your rights are not coming from the paper. They're coming from somehow some combination of you in relationship to your creator, the universal law, logos, how people want to think about those things, that is where rights come from. But they are exercised and created real in the moment only by your practice and your expression of them. So we're going to have to now think through that. What is it about public life i.e., where we actually are able to convene, coalesce, communicate, concur, all these kinds of, cons, where comms, where we come together, that is the realm of the public. And so we're going to have to reconsider what that means when we allowed it to become basically some kind of a California mall with servers in all around the world and a Delaware corporation that's sort of sponsoring our free speech. And meanwhile, now we're going to complain about wearing cloth to potentially protect the most vulnerable of us when we're out in the public, when we haven't been doing anything serious in public to a large extent. And that includes me. Like, I definitely feel like I've underutilized my understanding of how powerful the public sphere actually is. That includes getting out on the street. That includes public events, speaking at public assembly, at government meetings, but also then, actually getting involved in public discourse, public deliberative democracy, or even representative democracy.
This is a good point you're making here, because this is one of, I would say it's a pretty negative side effect consequence of this, is that it's making people. I talked about like distrust in our population now, and partisanship and divisions, but on a personal level, it's making people distrustful of being out and having contact with their fellow peers. And on one hand, I understand being precaution and safety and precautionary measures in all this against the possible contracting of a very serious disease that we still really don't know all that much about at this point. But at the same time, though, as far as what you're talking about here with the kind of conversations that need to be had on the public forum is, we've talked, as you're describing here, I do see there being I do see a very negative effect to this distrust, not only in terms of individuals, but even distrust of people politically and speaking this and that, and people not knowing what to believe anymore, but also in terms of even personal contact. I think there's a massive distrust of being out around people. And I mean, that has, for safety measures possibly, but also a negative effect in terms of what you're talking about here, in terms of using the public forum as a means to have very important discourse about things.
Yes, I agree. So that's what it's going to take, is for a deliberation in many ways to figure out what it is that we want to do with our public rights and our public activities, right? And to not be driven by fear, but to be deliberative and figure it out what it is that we want to do. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you, Greg, for allowing me to vent a little bit, I guess.
Well, no problem. I think we maybe went a little longer with that topic than we initially wanted to, but I hope people got something out of it. And well, as I'm sure as time goes on, we'll be having these conversations again in the future as more and more happens and we learn more and more. And because we have no idea what kind of world we're going to be living in between now and January 1st, 2021. But I feel like we have a responsibility to put out information the best we can as what we see going on, and trying to articulate it to our audience out there. So anyway, we mentioned at the top of the show the 2020 election and Biden and Trump. And what I see is this 2020 election, I see as an intersection of corruption, narcissism on a scale I think we've never really seen before with the current president, and incompetence. It's a perfect intersection of what I call the business as usual corruption, extreme narcissism, and extreme incompetence, where you've got Donald Trump, the definition of narcissistic, if there ever was one, who at this point is either taking part in a mass gaslighting type of operation, or is just completely in over his head and has no idea what he's doing from day to day. I personally am more inclined to think towards the latter, although there's a lot of people around him who are pushing policies and agendas and know exactly what they're doing. But as far as the man himself in the White House, personally, I'd be more inclined to lean towards having no idea a lot of the time what he's doing from a day-to-day basis, although there could be some gaslighting going on as well. And his presumptive opponent is the epitomization of what you might call the Walking Dead. I mean, a man who has long been a fixture of the corrupt D.C. establishment, the swamp as we've known it, Joe Biden, who at this point does seem to be legitimately losing his mind, and his mental faculties seem to be deteriorating more and more as the days and weeks go on. But we've found a very interesting person. You've talked about this person a little bit in a couple of our long form shows. last summer and last fall. An interesting person who I think is an indicator of the first part of what I described of this intersection of varying phenomenons at play here, and that is the corruption side of it. And this is a man by the name of Meshulam Riklis. And Jeremy, do you want to? We could, if you want to describe a little bit about who he is, or else I could. Let's get into Meshulam Riklis. Very interesting person who you've alluded to a little bit, but we have not gone into a deep dive on.
Yeah, I just want to sort of give the context of discussing him, and that I believe that right now is a key moment in terms of what's being learned about publicly about the Epstein network from the victims of it, basically, right? So Maria Farmer has been did a long form. It wasn't meant to be a public interview with Whitney Webb, but they were both okay with it being released publicly. And one of the key pieces of it, there's a lot of interesting and important information about the nature of the network. But one of the key pieces of it is that it's an additional key factor in terms of evidence of what the Epstein network was doing, where Maria Farmer names Leslie Wexner as the basically the controller, the American controller of the operation that was loyal to some aspect of Israeli intelligence. Okay, so but also, and I've included links to this woman, and she's also a survivor of this network. Her name is Kirby Summers, and if people go back to antidotes in the realm of late summer, fall. But for sure, we talked about the nuclear hashtag Opstein, which actually came from when I made a mistake when I was, talking to Elizabeth Warren on the Iowa campaign trail. I referenced Opstein by accident, but so I put some of these links in that show, the nuclear Opstein. By early on up there by Kirby Summers, but people can go follow her on Twitter. She's writing a book, a sequential book, and look at her Twitter feed. There's some interesting information there, and she is her abuser is the Riklis, the son, the Ira, right?
Yes, Ira Riklis.
The son of Meshulam, and I'm just going to read just a couple paragraphs here from one of her chapters, and it's just a little excerpt from here that she's including. Okay, so The World According to Leslie Wexner by Kirby Summers, August 13th, 2019. And there's a photo of Leslie Wexner in 1985 in front of the Limited in New York City and a friend, Photo New York Magazine. Okay, quote, "The story I was going to write and the story I am writing are very different. While the media has focused on the superficial aspects of Wexner's relationship to Jeffrey Epstein, I'd remembered Wexner through my association with Ira Riklis. Ira Riklis is the son of Meshulam Riklis, owner of Rapid American Corporation, and from whom Wexner purchased the Lerner shops in 1984. Riklis the son was my abuser, and Riklis the elder hired a former State Department attorney named Max to keep tabs on me in 1993, when I was strong enough emotionally to leave Ira. Max and I communicated from 1993 through 2015 when he retired, moved from upstate New York to California, whereupon he informed me he was handing my file to Ira." That's a quote, "handing my file to Ira," unquote. "Based on the fact that I have been severely harassed both online and in person from the time I left Ira in 1993 to present day, and that I've had trouble finding anyone to help me on any level, police, attorney, media, I became my own sleuth. In order to know how to protect myself, I learned early on to keep tabs on the people Ira talked about, the people that were part of his world. One of those people was Leslie Wexner." Okay.
Thanks for that background, Jeremy. So we mentioned Meshulam Riklis, and we'll dig more into hoping to understand more and more about this as we learn more about this another aspect of this that lays into the Epstein network. But there are some facts that we've been able to establish about Meshulam Riklis, some interesting information that seems to link him both to Joe Biden on a direct level, and Donald Trump perhaps on a direct level, but on a at the very least a significant indirect level, going back to the Epstein network, as well as Michael Milken, who Trump of course pardoned a couple of months ago, along with the former disgraced New York 9/11 9/11 connected Bernard Kerik. Was Michael Milken, and it's interestingly we were digging back through chapter 5 of Hidden Tax on Humanity by Mel Rockefeller, the chapter on the Poland connection, which established the B'nai B'rith activities of Jerome Corsi as it relates to his long-term history. But also in this chapter, Meshulam Riklis is mentioned as being a mentor and a he was a mentor to Michael Milken, and also did business with Milken when Milken was at the heaviest stages of his junk bond financial empire in the 1980s. So there's a connection there with Riklis and
and it says that Riklis taught Milken one of his first ways to structure acquisitions using high yield junk bonds. And even when you go to Riklis's Wikipedia page, it recognizes that he is basically the godfather. Here's quoting from his Wikipedia page, business career, quote, Riklis is credited with having originated complicated paper transactions like high-yield bonds and leveraged buyouts to take over control of major companies, then doing paper switches of the assets into companies he owned. Okay, and so he has a deep history here, and he is Israeli, or I think he passed away last year. Early last year, but he is an Israeli. He was born in Turkey, I think, but he was an Israeli. And what's interesting about this too is if you think about the Epstein network, about the economic aspect of the Epstein network, where it's so obvious that he's not actually a trader or a businessman, but he's an intelligence operative with the cloak of being a hedge fund or investment guy. So if you can understand that someone like Riklis, who's the highest levels tied into the Israeli government, Israeli intelligence, and we'll get into more of that, then you can understand that if someone like this is the godfather of these very public, legal, maybe sometimes semi-legal instruments, financial instruments of leveraged buyouts and, junk bonds and certain kind of weaponized debt instruments or aggressively leveraged debt instruments, you can imagine that what Epstein was doing covert economics here. There's all kinds of other things going on in the background here in terms of the way that money is being washed, is moved, is transformed, is leveraged in a covert and global and intelligence-based capacity.
Yes, indeed. And so that's hence the being a mentor to Michael Milken, basically teaching a lot of the things that Michael Milken knows. And so then there's turns out though that Riklis also has a direct connection to Joe Biden. It appears a long-term connection to Joe Biden in terms of being a political financier of Biden's senatorial campaigns, as well as his, I believe, both his 1988 and 2008 presidential campaigns. We dug up an article from the Los Angeles Times from 1990 that we just dug up. The title of that article was April 19th, 1990, Campaign Gifts Flow from Rich. Donations to candidates are again unrestrained and the law virtually unenforced. Some of the heaviest spenders are over their legal limit. And this article talks about a lot of very prominent people who were involved with some of the excessive campaign spending of their time period. Of course, in the process of this, the name Donald Trump comes up in the article. Trump long loves to brag about the political donations he's given to people who do things for him. So there you go with that. But in this article, Joe Biden is referred to as Meshulam Riklis' favorite political candidate of the 1988 presidential cycle. And this was at a time when Riklis is setting himself up as a financial donor to Biden, around a time when Biden, through his role in the Senate, the varying Senate committees he was a part of, was playing a key role in one of the key roles in the bipartisan cover-up of the scandals surrounding the BCCI, Bank and Commerce and Credit International, as well as the bigger savings and loan scandals, which were very much in a lot of ways centered around people like Michael Milken and these other financial raiders of the time period. So here you have Joe Biden, who we've already know there's a lot of questions regarding his relationship with Ukraine and Russia and the bigger picture going on there. A lot of questions regarding the Biden family's financial transactions with China. And then we throw this Meshulam Riklis in here, this Turkish-born Israeli citizen who, in addition to being a mentor to Michael Milken, also, as we learned in an Executive Intelligence Review article, I don't have the title of it in front of me.
Well, there's a few of them. One is called "A Bigger Scandal: Illegal
This
U.S.
is the
Funding
article, I
of
believe.
Sharon's Likud." And I'm just going to read
Yes.
the title of these three that are interesting: Ariel, Sharon, and the West Bank land scam, and then Ariel, Sharon, profile of an unrepentant war criminal. Actually, that one has a whole series of articles under it, and there's just a lot of interesting information here for people to run down.
Yes. Well, anyway, it's mentioned in, and I believe this was mentioned in the scandal of the illegal U.S. Contributions to Sharon's Likud, that Meshulam Riklis gave Ariel Sharon a property in Israel that he used for meetings with very high-level mega group style figures. That these meetings were all about, seem to be at least largely about, ways to take over and further consolidate Israeli control over the West Bank, which of course goes in terms of settlements. It's a key, very, very key proponent, or very key part of this very hardline Zionist operation that we've seen playing out, that's really come to fruition under Trump. For the first time in history, you have a president who seems to just be giving Israel an absolute, complete green light to do whatever it pleases in that region without the usual pushback that comes along with it. And Riklis is responsible for giving Ariel Sharon, the butcher of Sabra and Shatila, the sitting prime minister at the time of September 11th, this property where he holds these high-level meetings with a number of different people. I believe Henry Kissinger was said to have attended a couple of these meetings as well, on aspects of consolidating control over West Bank, increased settlement building, and continuing to push particular Zionist agenda that is more in the hardline direction. And this makes me raise the question of someone like Joe Biden. Was he put into even the Obama presidency as a possible insurance policy for these particular interests, to be ensured that it would just still remain business as usual on the Democratic side of things? I don't know.
Yes, but the fact that this guy Riklis, and so little focused on, and I just want to point out one more time that the main thing here that really hasn't yet been fully run to ground, and even a lot of the interviews that have been done with Whitney Webb, it appears to me that a lot of people want to not focus on what is sort of so obvious, is that they're describing a specific intelligence operation that's very much tied to a very specific aspect of Israeli intelligence. Now, we already knew this, but this is now beginning to expand it, and Maria Farmer specifically pointed out that the Rothschilds have been a serious sponsor directly of the Maxwells, and she fills in the gaps of what's being done in terms of a gaslighting of the American public and the public of the world about the timeline of people like Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and that Maxwell, as you would suspect, as we've explored the background of Robert Maxwell, someone like Ghislaine, she grew up in these circles, in these royalty circles. And this is not something recent, and this is not something that, she and Epstein just she got involved in this business when she and Epstein met in New York in the 90s. No, this has been going on much longer than this. And so then the question to drill down on, obviously, is who else is involved in this network? What is the, beyond just the human consequences of this, which are severe on their own, just like they are on September 11th. But then on top of that, what is the political leverage operation? What is the policy that goes along with this blackmail operation? And last week we referenced once again that something like the Iraq War might have been one of the policy outcomes of this, but the war on terror might be one of the outcomes of this. And so we then have to consider this in the age of COVID and the newest 311 in terms of these networks. Where are they? And last thing, I just wanted to point out that this British connection here, As we've talked about in terms of the left in place, the NATO stay behind army, but in terms of maybe more an Israeli aspect of this, in terms of the Mr. X committee in the United States of America, the high level in place people who actually facilitated spies such as Jonathan Pollard. Meanwhile, back in the UK, there's this question of who's the missing person on the biggest spy scandal, maybe of the Western world in the post-World War II era, the Cambridge spy scandal. And it looks more and more like it was Victor Rothschild, who, and remember, Kim Philby is at the epicenter of all of that. And Victor Rothschild ends up being playing a key role of UK Prime Minister Ted Heath, right? He was the Prime Minister, I think, Greg, right? At some point, Ted Heath.
Yes, Edward Heath. He was Prime Minister. I don't have the exact years. He was Prime Minister in the 1970s. I'm sure maybe if we have any British listeners, can maybe inform us more about Mr. Heath, as it's kind of the first time we're really seriously looking into it. We'd heard the accusations of pedophilia that had emanated from varying sources, but we really haven't looked much into Heath. He was Prime Minister in the 1970s.
So this question of Victor Rothschild in the UK as the sort of Mr. X that was sort of left after the Cambridge spy ring was wrapped up with Kim Philby and all of them. But then meanwhile, he's there then into the 70s and into the 80s, I think, highest levels of the UK security services, interfacing with the Prime Minister and hanging out with Ted Heath at his country manor right in the midst of where these allegations of hardcore pedophilia networks, obviously also some kind of greasing the wheel blackmail operation going on over there. There's obviously interface with these networks, the Maxwells. Epstein, as we pointed out, was in the UK pre-Iraq war. Okay, so this is still waiting to be uncovered, and yet there's also then this question, the Soviet connection, if you talk about Victor Rothschild. So how is this all connected? And I would just want to let you, make sure that you get all of our points in, Greg, if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. I want to go back to that long term, what appears to be a connection of at a sub level, an extended connection or extended level, very similar type of global spy operations going on. As you talked about Victor Rothschild, the Cambridge Five, and then moving on even into the Mr. X scandal of the 1980s. I want to move back to that in a second. One of the things that there are a couple things in these EIR articles, specifically on Ariel, Sharon, that I found very interesting. That one of the things that I found was what appears to be an intersection of mafia interest, hardline Zionist interest, and also interest within the oil and energy sectors, which is very interesting, as we've seen with Trump's Russia policy. Whatever the bigger geopolitical policy is, energy plays very significantly into it. We've also talked about energy as being a key component of aspects of the Epstein operation through people like Bill Richardson, the energy secretary under President Bill Clinton, and the significance of the nuclear Los Alamos out in New Mexico and the Epstein, New Mexico ranch. So that's it.
And even the Genie Energy as sort of a central location of both the bipartisan and the specific interests related potentially to the Trump campaign.
So you can see through some of the names mentioned in these particular EIR articles, and then you could go and corroborate that through some further research. I'm going to share a couple of links showing a specific interest as far as funding to Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy from these varying mega group style interests, which is very much an intersection of big business and organized crime and also an intersection of Zionism as well, and then oil and energy interests going into the coffers of one of the major think tanks pushing a lot of the very hardcore war on terror propaganda, which is Gaffney's Center for Security Policy, and other similar hardline war on terror think tanks and organizations. That's one of the things that stuck out to me from these articles. Another thing that stuck out to me, this is where I'm going back to the long-term operation of these networks we're talking about, is the closeness that Henry Kissinger has had. A key, very, very key player in some of these, when you think about this long-term operation that's going on, that we've been discussing going back to the Cold War, and then obviously coming all along with 9/11 and 11/9 and Donald Trump and all things related to that. Kissinger's a key player in that. But Kissinger's closeness to a lot of these very hardline Zionist figures and movements really sticks out to me through these articles. I mean, the fact that Kissinger was in attendance at some of these Ariel Sharon meetings at this property that Meshulam Riklis had given to Sharon for meetings on West Bank policy and other aspects of Israeli policy. And so that made me reevaluate Kissinger from the perspective of, and this is speculation, but this is me just kind of laying out a hypothesis here, something to think about for further conversation, is Kissinger's comment that Israel will not, the comment that's been attributed to Kissinger, the quote, that Israel will not exist in 10 years. So I was thinking about that in relation to this. And I mean, a lot of people might have a lot of different perceptions of that, but I wonder if there's possibly is Kissinger referring to Israel as we know it in terms of Israel, an Israel that relies on the U.S. for its security needs and for its long-term stability? I mean, is that what he's referring to? Because, and I thought about this because there is an aspect of the Trump operation, we've identified this very much with the Russian-centric aspects of it, that does, while Trump is making all these heavy-handed moves towards ensuring, moving U.S. policy towards Israel in a direction that it really has not fully moved into, which is not only the usual U.S. being the caretaker of Israel's security and long-term fortunes, but also moving the U.S. in a direction unprecedented support for all of the various hardline policies there are, whether it's the moving of the embassy, the recognition of Golan Heights as belonging to Israel, giving the green light to unlimited settlement building, which is usually not something that has not really been given to Israel by other administrations in the past. But there's also an element of this that is looking to remove the U.S. as the primary power broker in that region of the world. And we've identified this before with the shift to the east, with Russia and China more or less stepping in to be the primary power brokers in the region. So if you think about this from this perspective, I wonder if perhaps Kissinger is referring to a long-term policy of, Israel as we know it. Of course, it's just me theorizing here. Is it referring to Israel as we know it no longer existing in terms of Israel and the U.S. as the primary power broker? I don't know, but I think it's something to throw out there. And you, Jeremy, identified the what you called the Kissinger-Trump with some of the remaking of the Middle East, and then as opposed to the Obama-Brzezinski line of trying to hold down the traditional, U.S. foreign policy where. So you want to maybe talk a little bit about what you were thinking with regards to that?
Sure, and we're sort of heading towards our last 30 seconds here, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis that you bring up around what Kissinger is implying. Obviously, when you look at the Trump administration's approach to Israel, it's not really so like push, giving them lots of things, except for taking hands off. Yes, an embassy move, but when you really see it, there's a lot of washing of hand. I'm washing my hands of this, basically, is sort of the Trump move over there, and that does, of course, sort of push things to the other sphere who's going to step on in. And I do think that there is this explains a few things that I think we should explore into the future. But we will continue to explore both where we come from, this historical aspect, our current analysis, and then where we're going. But maybe more importantly, where we want to go, where we intend to go, where we believe we must go as both moral and creative beings. So till next week, Antidote, we out.
All right, goodbye.
Bye.